Well,
The fact is that in the South Pacific, we actually face a brief encounter with the Secretary-General in Poland.
Stop subsidies to fossil fuels. Taxpayers' money should not be used to boost hurricanes, to spread drought and heat waves, to bleach corals, or to melt glaciers. Stop the construction of new coal plants by 2020. We want a green economy, not a grey economy in the world.
chat to any of our school kids, and were you particularly impressed by any initiatives or any of their...
Political will is not yet able to accompany the pace of climate change. And the message from the Pacific to governments around the world is that, indeed, it's important to move taxes from salaries to carbon, to tax pollution and not people.
Aqui no Maranhão tem outro país, Becoi! Eita, mano, e vai tomar dois!
Our lifespan have also brought a dramatic increase of inequality. Climate change is, in my opinion, the defining issue of our time, the biggest threat to our lives and to the life of the planet, and we are not winning the battle against climate change. And we need the leadership of the youth in relation to this, because those that have today responsibilities in the world, especially governments, are largely, with exceptions, and I would underline the very important progress that is being made in New Zealand, but in many decisive parts of the world, governments are not showing enough political will.
Areas next to the sea that are soon going to be either eroded away or
global extinction crisis.
Advocacy in relation to effective.
Welcome you here, and on behalf of this community, I know that many of the young people here are really happy and pleased that you decided to make your way here to the centre of the universe, as Veronica calls it. South Auckland is the Pacific hub, is what we call it in the world. So I know many of these youth will be really happy and grateful that you came here today. Now, touching on what you just said, you said the voices of the youth are crucial on these two topics, climate change and new technologies. Now, can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it is clear my generation is having enormous difficulties in assuming responsibilities in relation to climate change. We see many governments hesitating. We see that what was agreed in Paris, which is not enough. I mean, Paris fixed the goal. But at the same time, and the goal is okay, even if now we know that 1.5 degrees should be the limit. Even 2 degrees is too much. But Paris fixed the goal. But in Paris, governments made commitments. Those commitments would not allow to reach the goal. If the commitments made in Paris would be fully fulfilled, we would still have, at the end of the century, an increase of more than 3 degrees of temperature, which would be a total catastrophic situation. So we need to improve our engagement, improve our commitments, and that is the reason why in 2020 we will have a renewal of the so-called national determined contributions, and that is why I'm convening a climate summit for September in order to try to increase the ambition in mitigation, in adaptation, and in finance. But the point is that we are not even fulfilling the commitments made in Paris, with exceptions. And New Zealand is fortunately one of the exceptions. But we are not fulfilling that. And we are seeing the political will fading. We are seeing countries more and more invoking difficulties or costs or whatever, when the cost of inaction is much higher than any eventual cost of doing the right thing. And so it is absolutely essential that the new generations that will live the full impact of climate change. I'm 70 years old. I will not be the one witnessing the full impact of climate change. It's absolutely essential that the new generations that will live the full impact of climate change are empowered and assume the capacity to force those that today have political responsibilities to understand that they need to change course.
When we talk about the new generation and we talk about the Pacific, many people here understand that the Pacific is bearing the brunt of the climate change impacts. Yet, when it comes to hearing voices of the youth and hearing voices of the Indigenous people on the ground, there seems to be a gap between what people are experiencing in the Pacific Islands and what policy leaders around the world are the decisions that they're making. And Indigenous people feel like their views or how they feel are they're not being listened to when it comes to the climate change debate. How crucial is the need for that to change when you're saying we're not even achieving the Paris goals? What needs to change?
The Pacific is one of the areas that contributes less to climate change and is more directly impacted, to a certain extent in some islands, as an existential threat. It's not only the Pacific. Look at Africa. The progression of drought in Africa is absolutely appalling. If you consider the Sahel, today it is clear that there is a close interlinkage between climate change, drought, and terrorism, and conflict. And so the areas that are not contributing to climate change, because it's not the African emissions or the Pacific emissions, are the areas that are in the front line of the negative impacts of climate change. And this is the problem. The areas that more contribute to climate change are not the more directly targeted. And it's absolutely essential for these to be reversed. It's absolutely essential for everybody to fully understand that this is a global responsibility. But even in those areas of the developed world that more contribute to climate change, the impacts are now being felt in a terrible way. Just an example, looking into the United States or Europe. The storms in the United States, the most devastating ever. Heat waves in Europe. The number of people that die in Europe because of heat waves is increasing exponentially. So it's not only the Pacific, it's not only Africa. Everybody is already having this impact. The Arctic is melting. Glaciers are receding. In many areas of the world, water scarcity will become a dramatic problem and generate terrible conflicts. We see, this is an area full of corals. No? Look at your neighbor, Australia, the great coral reef barrier. What we now know about the bleaching in the reef barrier is absolutely appalling. So this is everywhere. It's creating dramatic impacts everywhere. And so there is a common responsibility to reverse this trend. And it's absolutely... I must say I am enthusiastic about what more and more young people is doing. And the testimony of young people is having a huge impact, and this is one of the reasons I hope that we will not be too late and decisions will be made in 2019, in 2020, and in the years after, in order to be able to still reach the goals that were fixed in Paris.
In some Pacific countries, the young people have initiated movements like the no plastic ban. I think Vanuatu have banned plastic bags. Tonga has a no plastic bag ban. But there are neighbouring countries, bigger countries, that don't seem to be making the same commitment. What would you say to that? But
today, there is clear that single plastic use things should be banned everywhere. What we are witnessing, there is an area of plastic in the Pacific that is bigger than France. Area of the sea covered by plastic. And plastic is not, there is plastic that is degradable and that is not a problem. But the normal plastic starts to be divided into very small pieces, becomes microplastic. They are eaten by fish. They enter into the food, the food chain, and they become a serious threat for people eating fish, which means that, it's not only in the Pacific Islands, it's a problem that can impact everybody, everywhere. And so to ban single-use plastics is one of our main priorities in the Conference of the Oceans that we had in New York, and the next one is in Lisbon. And we hope that more and more countries are doing it, by the way. I think there will be soon a European directive in this regard for the whole of the European Union. And we see very important countries doing it. India promised to do it. Rwanda has done it 10 years ago, an African country. And we see a huge movement in that direction. But it's not only plastics. We have overfishing. We have coastal area deterioration. We have pollution going into the sea. We are still losing the battle of climate change, and we are still losing the battle of the oceans. And these two battles are vital for the Pacific.
Should New Zealand be doing better?
Oh, New Zealand is quite remarkable. First of all, New Zealand is introducing legislation in order to be fully in line with what the scientific community has told it was needed, which means carbon neutrality in 2030 and 1.5 degrees at the end of the century. New Zealand is also a country that has been quite supportive of other Pacific Island small states. And so one of the reasons I started this visit by New Zealand is exactly because I believe it is an example that many others should follow. To have a law that indicates that the objectives of Paris are a legal commitment is something that is very important. Because, as you know, the Paris Agreement is not legally binding. So it's very important that countries assume that responsibility.
We're about to open the floor to the public Q&A, but before I do, I've got one more question. We talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, just the top three alone, the first one's no poverty, second is zero hunger, third is good health and well-being. Now, if you look at New Zealand and the state that we're in, our youth suicide rate is the highest in the OECD countries. In this community alone, 1 in 2 children are in poverty. And in this community alone, they have the highest rates of diabetes and obesity. Are we on track as a nation to achieve those development goals? Should we be doing better?
I'm sure New Zealand will be able to do it, because you have the capacity to do it. Unfortunately, this will not be true globally. If one looks at the trends to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, and we worked with a group of Oxford statisticians just a few months ago, projecting the trends from the beginning until now to 2030, we will be more or less at midway between the situation in the beginning and the goals that were fixed, the specific goals that were fixed in relation to the different Sustainable Development Goals, which means that we need a huge mobilization of financial resources, first of all, but also of political will and of measures to be taken in order to achieve those goals.
Now, we'd just like to open the floor up to public Q&A, but I do need to stress that this is not a time for media, unfortunately, to come in with questions. I know that the UN Secretary-General would really like to hear from a lot of the young voices, so I'd love to invite students. If you could come up, there should be a microphone there at the back.
And if I may ask something, don't only ask questions. Give your own testimony, give your own opinions, express your criticism, because I'm also here to learn from you.
And a lot of us have family in the Pacific Islands or in areas next to the sea that are soon going to be either eroded away or flooded by rising sea levels. So we'd like to ask what actions the United Nations are taking to better equip Pacific Island nations to deal with rising sea levels and resultant population displacement?
I think we have two kinds of things. First, we need absolutely to stop the growth of emissions and to reach neutrality, as I said, in 2050, because the most important thing is to avoid waters to rise. But second, we need to start immediately or strongly increase the support that is necessary to build resilience in communities, because the impacts are already there, particularly in the Pacific, but in different other parts of the world in several ways, which means adaptation is as important as mitigation. Now, recently, in our dialogue with international financial institutions, we were very happy to see that the World Bank has decided to double its support to climate action, from 200 million to 400 million in 5 years, and that half of it will be for adaptation. Other international financial institutions are doing the same, and we are pushing a lot for the commitment of the international community of 100 billion to the development world from 2020 onwards, both from the private and the public sector, to have a large share for adaptation. So it is absolutely crucial that we mobilize a much stronger level of resources, including through the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund that has not been effectively used to support the Pacific. We need to have a much stronger mobilization of resources for adaptation. And it's not only the islands of the Pacific. I'll just give you another example. Look at the Himalayas. The glaciers are melting very quickly, and the full area of the glaciers is diminishing, which means that soon the water coming through the Indus, the Brahmaputra, and the other rivers will diminish. At the same time, the rising sea level will make the sea water move inwards. A country like Bangladesh might face, in a few decades, the need to relocate more than 20 million people. So, I mean, we are facing a dramatic problem in which the Pacific Islands are in the front line, but that will have impacts in coastal areas all over the world.